Hey it again. Can you hear me? Man, I hate doing the podcast over Zoom.
Yeah, I hear you just loud and clear. It's the only way I could make this happen this week. So I really appreciate you doing this.
That doesn't look like your home office. Where the heck are you?
I'm doing some work in the United States, and man, it's great to be away from 6 feet of snow in Winnipeg.
So it's like warm there?
It's so nice.
Are you wearing shorts and short sleeves?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get this straight. While we're all freezing here in the dark, you went away to a sunny location and you didn't take me. I mean, I thought we were a team. Negan and the Lone Ranger. When you leave the jurisdiction without telling me, man, it really puts the lone into Lone Ranger.
Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to leave you on your own. It won't happen again.
Oh, does that mean I can come with you on all your gigs? Like, we're a permanent duo, like Batman and Robin, Han Solo and Chewbacca, like Lone Ranger and.
Hold on there. I mean, we're a team. We're also individuals too. You know what I mean?
Oh, okay, fair enough. I guess I got nothing left to do but ride off into the sunset alone. No wingman. Hi-yo, Silver, away.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Negan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Negan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome to yet another episode of Negan and the Lone Ranger. I'm Dan Lett, joined by Negan Sinclair.
Here we are again. It's been yet another tough week in Winnipeg as we sort of sit in the wake here of what is just a national tragedy, but really also ground zero of what is, in so many different ways, a mixture of indifference, allegedly racism, uh, an issue that is unfolding so quickly that I think in many ways 150 years unveiling itself in so many different ways in our city, in our community. And it seems like a story that won't go away for a very long period of time, but it certainly is. The issue of murder missing Indigenous women and girls is something that is impacting all of us and is in all of our lives right now.
Last week, we were talking when we were talking about this. I mean, it was real time news cycle, things happening all the time. I think that the big evolution in the story last week was an admission, finally, by Winnipeg Police Service Chief Danny Smythe that when he decided back in June that they would not excavate the Prairie Green landfill, a privately owned landfill north of the city, to look for the remains of two of the victims of this serial killer. That it was, they had decided pretty much on their own that it was impractical and bordering on impossible. Now, there was a few, I was able to get a few other details of this. They did have a small plan that they were able to devise internally. It wasn't very extensive, maybe even just perfunctory, $150,000 plan to sort of get into the landfill. Somewhere between a month and 2 months after they think the remains went to that site, and it was rejected. This past week, Chief Smythe admitted that when he made that decision, he actually didn't have the expertise, either himself or in the department, to make that decision. And that's what I think has really added a level of concern to the story, and drawn attention to the chief's performance.
There's so many questions that are being unveiled in real time here. And of course, the real thing that was unveiled this week, that was around the Chief Smythe's. It seemed like such a knee-jerk decision, but it also has so many implications for the family of Mercedes Myron and Morgan Harris, because they need answers. They want to know. There's actually speculation now in the Indigenous community that all of this is a smokescreen and that somehow there's the remains at the Brady landfill. Of course, I think that's what happens when there's many unanswered questions. People start to speculate and people start to worry that the police are lying or that they're just not wanting to search. But the real big question is if they're not interested in finding the remains, what is the evidence that they have? And obviously, this is gesturing towards the case against Jeremy Skibicki, the alleged serial murderer of these 4 women. And when will we find that out? Will that be during the trial? Will it be some of the more distressing details that those of us in the media are hearing about? Of course, we have no way of being able to verify any of that information, but it's leading to much more trauma, much more division, and much more anger, particularly from Indigenous families that and advocates that want to find where these remains are, and they want the police to try. We know that there's resources in the province to do this work. For instance, in our colloquium at the University of Manitoba, in our Department of Indigenous Studies, we've had members from the province, specifically archaeologist Perry Blomquist, who has come in and he's been involved in human remain excavations, not only here, but elsewhere. And we have expertise here in Manitoba that has experience in studying, looking up human remains. So for the police chief to make a decision without consulting with the province seems very abnormal.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. Perry Blomquist apparently consulted on the Picton case in British Columbia. And for anybody that kind of wants to see there is a parallel between that case and this case, at least in terms of the challenge of the search. It was the search of the Picton farm, in the Lower Mainland, was an extraordinary process that involved, but it was a partnership between police and hundreds of civilian experts in forensics and archaeology. They searched this entire sprawling farm that was full of all kinds of, buried equipment and animal carcasses, huge manure, dumps and ponds. And, and they went in, and this is to your point again, they went in with the idea, though, that they needed this evidence to make the case against Robert Picton. And that, I'm sure there was a degree of compassion as well, but they needed that evidence. And, the horrifying, scenario that's coming at us is that we're eventually going to find out that in addition to not, really being tone deaf to the needs of the families, the victims' families, is that, that they won't have enough evidence to get a conviction because they didn't go look for it.
There's precedents for successful searches across the United States. I see that our colleagues at the CBC have unveiled a story where they've consulted with the U.S. consultant to say, is this something where there would be information, other information that could be uncovered, not just human remains, but also potentially information and clues to support the case. So the fact that the police don't seem to be motivated by that seems to me to say that they've got other evidence that they may be satisfied with, but certainly will not satisfy the needs of those families. One other thing that came out that I wasn't aware of this week, and I'm not sure if you're aware of, that there's a significant difference in their earlier search at the Brady landfill site because it's owned by the city, and that this Prairie Green landfill site is privately owned. And so that kind of makes the fact that the premier and the mayor, would really be the premier, I suppose, to order the ceasing of operations at the Prairie Green landfill site out near Stony Mountain. It seems to be there's going to be some sort of compensation for those private owners. that certainly will come into play here. And it makes it more significant that they stopped work there to make a decision on what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I think so. I'll be the first to admit, and it's hard for a journalist to admit they don't know everything, but I did not know that the city's refuse contractor was using a private site. So I think that, yes, like I think that we're quickly getting to a position where, regardless of the success or lack of success of a search, I don't see how that site can reopen. And I'm, I don't know the practical problems that creates. Obviously, a big city like Winnipeg is probably going to need multiple landfill sites. Something's going to have to be done to compensate and work with the company. But, definitely, like, I can't see how that could possibly be allowed to continue serving as an active landfill site when we know that it's become, for lack of a better term, it's sacred ground now, to a certain extent. That the remains are there. I think the other thing that was quite interesting, and a reader brought my attention to this, the city is a very complex system where the trucks are plotted and tracked when they go into the dump. There's GPS locators so that they know where the trucks went to dump, each individual load. And quite frankly, not that this happens, every day, but it is remarkable how many cases, serial murder cases, involve trying to find things in landfills. And if we're going to allow private companies to operate private dumps to support refuse collection, maybe it should become standard that there's more work done to track the trucks and make sure that we have a way of tracking back the load from an individual truck as much as possible.
Absolutely, that there needs to be some kind of fail-safe method to be able to articulate, to be able to keep track of. If we're fully aware, as many people on Twitter have now done, by the police signing off and saying we're not going to search, it's almost as if you're directing, as many advocates in the Indigenous community said, it's almost like you're directing people to, if you want to get rid of evidence, just send it to the landfill. And it's now publicly known that something has to be done, something has to be dealt with. Regardless of the amount of time that this will take to make a decision, the answers will not be good enough for Indigenous families until the remains are found. And I think that there's, in the midst of all of this discussion around the impossibility of finding remains at landfill sites, we can't forget that, it took 14 months of investigation in Toronto to find the remains of Nathaniel Brito. Mm-hmm. But they did it. And they did it at the Green Lane landfill, just near Toronto, that when his remains were sent there, I think they had a similar situation to what is found right here in Winnipeg, but that now people are saying no. In Toronto, they found a successful search, but it did take a great deal of time. And that will be probably the only method to be able to rectify and build relationships between the police and Indigenous communities in this situation. Mm-hmm. Dan, this is also a week that has been, I think, hard for the Premier. As much as the Premier, I think, did intervene in a good way in this situation to stop work at the landfill site, the Premier also gave a state of the province speech that very much sounded like a pre-election speech. The election here in Manitoba is just over a year away, or I guess it'd be under a year away now, eh?
Yeah, October, on or before October 2023. Our colleague, Tom Broadbeck at the Free Press, covered the speech and described it as more of a eulogy than a genuine sort of rah, here we go, Manitoba's going to do well, which is kind of the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce State of the City, State of the Province speeches tend to be more pep rallies than anything else. And it's just patently clear that Heather Stephenson, for all the good and perhaps bad that she's brought to the job since taking over last November, does not appear to be the solution for the progressive Conservatives. She remains unpopular. Her government remains unpopular. And more importantly, and we'll talk about this more in the third segment, the last segment of our show today, they don't seem to be able to dig themselves out of trouble on the big files. She came in with a mandate to be the anti-Brian Pallister, to change the tone of the government. And what we see is the government, on some files, absolutely different tack, different solutions, but so often just stuck in the same silly stuff that this government has fallen prey to for the last 6 years.
The optics on this are absolutely terrible. We know the long history of what they often call the glass cliff, which is you have a male leader of a party or a male head of a CEO or some male head of an organization who comes in, much fanfare for a long time, runs roughshod, often with his solo kind of leadership, eventually brings the party or the business to the brink of failure. And then a woman is appointed to sort of foresee or to take through the business in a new direction, but it is so impossible to do it with the existing infrastructure that she's often treated as the sacrificial lamb for another man to come in. And so I hope that the Conservatives are aware that this imagery, the optics of this, looks absolutely terrible. And for Manitoba's first female premier to have kind of a Kim Campbell-esque delivery in her first term, that she's going to lead the Conservatives into an election where in many ways it's not going to be a destruction like the Conservatives in the 90s, but it's going to be quite ugly in Winnipeg.
The scenario, it's pretty stark. Like I would say, there's a couple of seminal moments that are coming up. Premier Stephenson will have another budget. And, I think they're planning, they're sort of angling right now to be able to provide a major rebound on the budget deficit and possibly, get very close to balancing the budget, or at least very close to being able to predicting when they can. After that, there's a whole summer worth of campaigning to be done. There's time left, and this is certainly not the history is not set in stone on this, but it's going to be a rough, bumpy year. There's no doubt.
It's not without effort. Heather Stephenson has, in many ways, more than Brian Pallister, has come out as kind of a champion of the premiers by being the head of the premiers on this issue of healthcare. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's been not without a great deal of effort. I mean, Heather Stephenson, I've seen her at every event. I've seen her working very hard. She's even, come up. I mean, I'll be honest. Like, I've never been at an event where Brian Pallister's walked up to me, but I have been at events where Heather Stephenson has gone out of her way to say hello and to be cordial. And so, in so many different ways, I think that she's trying, but it's just too uphill at this point.
On that note, I think it's time.
But it's a sad note.
It's now time for the storytellers.
I'm Brad Oswald. I'm the perspectives editor at the Winnipeg Free Press. I'm also a musician of sorts, and I play in a local band called Fixed Income. And this is the Storytellers. Here's a story about a musical moment that made a profound impression on me and my bandmates. About 10 years ago, my wife and I were touring Italy with a group that also included one of my bandmates, a guy named Dale. So we arrived in Rome in the blistering heat of late August, and after a long day of touring around, we went looking for a bar that could serve us a cold beer. The one we found happened to be owned by a couple of friendly guys from Eritrea, of all places, and we quickly decided that this would become our local for as long as we were in Rome. The next night, after another hot day, we stopped in for a beer to take the edge off the evening heat, and we asked the owner, John, if he had a patio or an outdoor space of some sort where we could gather. He led us to a starlit space out behind the bar and set up a table for 10. It was perfect. Well, almost. I said to my bandmate Dale, the only thing that would make this better would be if we had a guitar. So he called John, the owner, over and he asked me if he had one. He said no, but then he paused and he said, if you come back tomorrow. So, of course, we did. So, back in our private little courtyard behind this crowded bar, we passed the guitar, which John had produced as promised, back and forth, and we're singing songs and having a lovely time. When Dale's turn with the guitar came, he started playing the old John Denver song, Take Me Home Country Roads. And as we all sang along to this familiar tune, we noticed a couple of the bar's regulars, Eritreans, we presumed, coming out into the courtyard. Then a few more. Some started dancing. Others just stood watching. One gentleman appeared to be weeping as we sang. When the song ended, that guy came over, placed his hand on my friend Dale's arm and said, "Again?" So we played it again. More people came outside. Dancing continued until it seemed everyone in the bar had joined us outside. The song ended, and then there was another again. We ended up playing it 4 times. It was a particularly powerful moment that we didn't really understand, but became kind of a running joke inside the band. Every time we played Take Me Home Country Roads in a show, we'd share a version of that story. And still we didn't really get why it happened until a couple of years ago when we were playing a show up in Lake Country. In between sets, a woman came up to me and said, "I'm a professor of African history, and I can tell you why." She went on to explain that Eritreans living abroad have typically fled the country to escape human rights abuses. As much as 10% of the population has left and thousands more leave every year, but they still feel a great sense of connection and a yearning to return. And it's because of that this song, which says, "Country road, take me home to the place I belong," is incredibly resonant and important. It's about home. Something we can all appreciate, I guess. It was an unforgettable moment my friends and I experienced on a steamy night in Rome with a bunch of people we didn't know who were also very far from home.
I'm here flying solo for our feature interview this week, which is a look into a new installation at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Headlines The Art of the News Cycle. It was created to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Winnipeg Free Press, which, if you're a Free Press subscriber, you may have heard one or two things about. And I'm very lucky this morning that I'm getting to talk with the curator and really the creator of this exhibit, Riva Symko. Good morning.
Morning. I'm super excited to be on this podcast.
Yes, well, it's thank God people seem to be excited to be on the podcast, so we're going to go with that for now. So the first tough questions right off the bat. It is by observation, because we've crossed paths 2 or 3 times. It appears that you have one of the largest personal collections of headline and newsprint inspired clothing, of anybody I know. And so, was that always a thing for you, or just something that came along with the exhibit?
No, I am a big collector of prints. I have a lot of military print. I have a lot of polka dots and stripes. But I've been collecting newsprint specific clothing since I started working on this show. And actually the first dress that I bought in newsprint very early on, maybe a year and a half ago, it became the inspiration for the wallpaper design that's in this show that is the background for a few art pieces. So, and it's an amalgamation of a bunch of different Winnipeg Free Press articles in black and white and kind of made to look like a wallpaper print itself. Yeah. So, so now I do have a
traditional newspaper design, like that stark black and white. I mean, it does, I'm not objective about this at all, obviously, right? But it does have its own design impact. And particularly people seem to be drawn to getting closer and closer and reading, all the words of the actual newspaper articles that are in there. So, but we'll talk more about the wallpaper, which you meant, my editor Paul Simin is threatening to redo his entire house in this wallpaper. So, and I think his wife Kathy's not thrilled, but we'll see.
Sorry, Kathy.
Well, we don't even know if that much wallpaper is available. Okay, so an exhibit like this, and I'll say off the bat, the first time I saw it, it was not what I expected it to be, which was a good thing. But we'll talk more about that. So, but let's first deal with how something like this comes together, because obviously this wasn't thrown together at the last moment. So, what's the origin story of the exhibit?
Yeah, so the exhibition started out as a conversation between my director, Stephen Boris, and your editor, Paul Simin, talking about the upcoming, at that time, anniversary of the Free Press, the 150th anniversary, which was a few years out at that point. And Stephen had this idea of, wanting the WAG to do something to celebrate that, and especially because, the Free Press has covered a lot of the WAG stories and a lot of our exhibitions over, whatever century and a half.
Yeah.
So when the assignment came to me, I was actually not super thrilled about it, to be honest, because I didn't see it as something that I could do. I'm not a historical curator. I'm not a museum curator in that sense that deals with a lot of necessarily archives or objects per se. I'm an art curator, right?
Yeah.
And so I was a little worried about what Paul and Stephen had in mind for the show. But after I sat down and talked to Paul and some others from the Free Press, they were so just enthusiastic about having a show that dealt more broadly with media and newspapers in the 21st century, and news in general, and fake news and advertising and news, and a lot of kind of larger issues and concepts that we all deal with. That I was like, oh, okay, I can do that, no problem. I know artists who are working on these exact ideas and themes.
Yeah, there's only so many like old hand presses and plates and things that you can sort of tolerate in a single, even me, in a single exhibit. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and some people are really into that, especially, my husband's a printmaker, so, he's into that kind of thing and those kind of objects, and a lot of people are, but it's just not what I do or what necessarily the WAG does. We're a very art-focused place, right?
Sure.
But as soon as I, from there was able to just turn to artists and just look for artists that were thinking about a lot of these broader ideas too, then it was easy, and then I got really excited, and that's when I started building my own wardrobe collection.
A living, walking piece of newsprint art.
That's what I've become.
So that I would say that was the biggest surprise, and but also the most thrilling discovery was to come in and see that you had commissioned work from Manitoba artists to not really, I wouldn't say it's necessarily to interpret the Free Press. I mean, that was part of it, but it seemed to be sort of a broader, what is a newspaper? How does it connect to the community? What impacts does it have? What is community from the perspective of a news organization, that kind of thing. And, like my wife and I, one of the great things about living in Winnipeg is the ability to meet artists and acquire their work, things created by them that, maybe people in bigger cities don't have that opportunity. So
And as it turns out, Winnipeg artists are some of the best in the world.
Yep.
I mean, some of Canada's best visual art exports are from Winnipeg, or were schooled in Winnipeg, or had some connection to Winnipeg. So, not only do we have direct connection with artists in a smaller community, but the ones in Winnipeg happen to be really stellar. Just again, I'm not particularly objective about these things, but there was, and we'll talk about it afterwards, but there was one piece in particular that everybody who worked at the Free Press stopped and went, it was kind of right for the old jugular. Is that Miriam's piece?
Yeah, in a good way. In a good way, but in a way too that I'm not sure. I'm hoping to talk to her. But I'm not even sure she may have realized the visceral impact of that piece. But we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
So break down the exhibit into its major components for me.
So there's a mix of kind of all types of artistic media here, in with some, historical objects, some archival papers that I got from the the dating way back to 1867, I think is the earliest one in the show. No, the earliest one is, of course, 1872, which is the first edition, of course, right? But then there's all medias, so there's textiles represented, embroidery, printmaking, of course, video, photography, painting, installation, sculptures. So I wanted it to be pretty dynamic and a range of ideas coming together. So I think that's what you see when you walk in. You're not the first person that said they were surprised that it wasn't I think people are expecting more of a museum style historical show, but it's definitely an art show. There's also a spot where we're sitting right now in the show that's an activity area. We're calling it the newsroom, which
it's Spartan furnishings are actually not inappropriate for what we back on the Carlton Street newsroom days. This would have worked just fine,
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's
it's more for like family area, just for fun, but yeah.
So okay, so there are a few artifacts, so to speak. Is that the appropriate word for? Okay, so there's some of the old cylindrical plates that we used to use back in the hot type days. With the, did you ever see the strips of lead? That the bendy strips of lead that they used to use for the hot type.
I don't. Yeah, I've seen images of them. I haven't seen them in person, but actually, that big cylindrical one we have there is also lead.
Yeah.
And then there's several color. There's one of the first color plates images is here, so you can see there, which is multiple plates because each plate would have a different color.
Yes.
And then have to be run through the press. The same paper several times, right?
That's
to get all the layers of color on. So there's examples of that in the show. The actual very first Free Press.
That's right. The Red River.
That came from New York City by Luxton. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's an amazing piece of equipment, and actually, I mean, you mentioned your husband is a printmaker.
Yeah.
And like printmakers look at that and they see like a lot of continuity in the technology.
I mean, press technology hasn't actually evolved that much. The way that we use it, certainly, right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, not even. Yeah. But and this piece is in pretty good shape. It's missing a few parts apparently, but if it could be used again if we wanted to. Yeah,
and this is hard to translate into a podcast format, but I mean the term press, freedom of the press, it does come from the fact that the original presses were machines where you had to pull the lever and press the plate against the paper, ink it by hand, and I mentioned
several hundred times.
That's right. I mentioned the lead strips because back when I started in the Free Press in 1980, like a million years ago, we all had our own desks. But we had to share computer terminals, and the terminals were just for for writing stories. They weren't connected to any internet or anything at that time. But I remember when I was given my first desk at the Free Press, I opened up one of the drawers, and there was a stack of the lead strips.
Oh, really?
Still there.
Yeah.
So it was like we were never on Carlton Street in particular. We were never that far away from the very origins. Mm-hmm. You used to be able to go down onto Carlton Street and look through the windows where the presses were, and the pressmen all made they all made hats out of the newsprint.
That's right.
And
yes.
Yeah, and it's I'm not saying these days in the days of the gram, people may not appreciate the loving attention. Mm-hmm. It was an artisanal activity.
Handmade product.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. From start to finish.
But the star of the show certainly is the interpretation that the artists have made. So when you I'm going back to your reaction, which was like an art installation on newspaper. So how do you have the conversation with the artists, and what guidelines, if any, were they given, or were they just told Free Press 150 community go?
So a lot of these works were actually pre-existing works, with the exception of Miriam Rudolph's series of prints. So the pre-existing works were artists that I'd been following and knew that they were interested in media in general. Miriam's piece was commissioned for the show. It's a set of 16 prints. I really wanted to commission a printmaker because of that connection to the press. And I really wanted it to be a local person who had some sort of personal identification with the Winnipeg Free Press in particular, and with the history of this place, right, mm-hmm. and the locality of it. And Miriam had just finished another project that was also looking at a different set of archives at the British Museum. And I thought, that's actually a perfect thing, I think, for Miriam, who's an artist I know and have, worked with before, to continue this idea of looking at archives and creating something out of that. So I pitched the idea of creating a series for this show. And from there, she had free reign. She could do whatever she wanted. I did want her to include some aspect of the Free Press archives in some way. And she, she took off from there.
Yeah. It's really funny because we were talking about the other Free Press people that came with to see the show about the trigger points that came from her work. So that the one really impactful one is the one where it has a picture of the stacks of newspapers on shelves, and which is not actually, those are not images of the original library, both at Carlton Street and then when we moved to Mountain Avenue, we had a physical library and a team of librarians that clipped every article out of the newspaper and put them in envelopes, and then created like large scrapbooks of the pages. But we also had a section where we put, I don't know, a dozen of every day's paper in, and there was, in this one stack, there was a year's worth of Free Presses there, and if you really wanted to see your story that you published 3 months ago, you would just go in and grab a newspaper and so that was like I was looking at that print with the only other employee at the Free Press who's been there longer than I have, Margaret McMillan, and I said, oh my God, and she said, I know, like it was just
recognizable.
Oh yeah, and it was just, but it was also like a reminder of the library and before digital archives, and where we had the microfiche machines in the back. But there were other images as well. Like there are other prints with map grids and pictures of homes. And again, like I talked to somebody who said, what that makes me think of? It makes me think of the big map of Winnipeg. We had a big map of Winnipeg and a big map of Manitoba up on the wall.
In the newsroom.
Really? And that's where, like, if somebody said, where the hell is blah, blah, blah street? We looked it up on these maps. So, it's a subsequent interview, warning to listeners. I'll be interviewing Miriam, I hope, about how she interpreted the mission. But it is, so for non-newspaper people, like, what kind of reaction have you been getting?
Well, wait, let me go back to what you were just saying about that visual representation of that archive of the paper, right?
Yeah.
And we don't see that unless you're someone like Miriam who's going in, she went into the digital archives and the physical archives, right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting that even you in the business don't see the visual aesthetic representation of what you're doing every day, the sort of profundity of it and the amount of it, just the sheer scale of the information that you're putting out there every day, as the way you used to in the past, perhaps, right? And that struck me when I went to what are now the archives in the provincial legislature building archives of the papers, and just the sheer enormity of the amount of information that is kept in these historical papers, right?
True story. Like if I'm talking to someone of a younger generation, which thankfully my work allows me to do, one of the things that I challenge them to do is to spend one weekend and get a copy of the Sunday New York Times and read the physical newspaper, because the scope of the information that's in, and really it's one of the things that we lose online. Like every story is a rabbit hole, and once you get into it, like we try to provide access to other information, but it's a very sort of focused on that story. When you open up a page of a newspaper, you get to see multiple stories. If you keep following the pages, like after a while, what I've told a lot of people is, I bet you lunch, beer, whatever you want to bet, that you will see a dateline from a country or a place that you didn't even know existed. And despite all the changes that we've undergone, we're still like pumping it out. Is that so? Well, let me ask you an interesting question. So prior to doing this, what would you have said your newspaper consuming habits were? Like, did you read it online? Did you ever read the physical? Because in your business, art is a tactile experience.
That's
still.
right. Yeah, that's interesting. So, interesting question, because of late I've been more of a radio person. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. We're sort of on the radio now, so
true.
We're good. Yeah. Okay.
And so I'd say the majority of my news I get from the radio. However, and then from there probably online. But I am a weekend newspaper reader and have been for a long time. I don't buy every weekend paper,
Sure.
and I've move around into which paper I will physically buy. Depends, which one is the thickest that weekend, or which one looks the best.
On a a gram basis. That's right. Yeah.
But I am like that Sunday paper, Saturday paper kind of reader, specifically because the weekend also presents you with that opportunity to sit back and have the time to look at something physically, get in deep, maybe read a whole section cover to cover.
Long form.
Yeah, whereas an online consumption, even radio consumption, kind of lends itself more to doing in between things, or just looking up one thing in particular, or maybe cruising around a bit between different web pages, but not really thinking about or having an experience, like a conscious experience with it. You're just sort of fact finding in a way. So that's kind of my newspaper consumption. It's become more now since doing this show. Obviously, just consuming the physical paper has become a part of the sort of research for this show. But my very first job that I ever had was in a newspaper. I'm from a small town in Alberta, Rocky Mountain House, and I worked at the Rocky Mountaineer. Shout out! And they. I was doing what
was it a weekly or a daily?
It was a weekly paper.
Yeah.
It's still a weekly paper.
Yeah.
It's still around. And
Nice.
I was cutting out the ads for the ad department, which was one guy, and filing them away for him.
Yeah.
Ernie Murius. Oh my gosh, I'm just remembering that now. But that was my very first job.
So you're now part of the fraternity. You're part of the brotherhood, sisterhood
Yeah,
now.
wait a second.
I didn't even
I'm
know
part of
that.
you guys.
Holy cow!
I'm part of the club.
Well, that's fantastic. I think that the part of the underlying message of all this too is just the importance of the news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is my biggest fear is not whether people will read the Free Press or read the Globe and Mail or read National whatever, but it's whether they'll read, whether they'll consume the news
thoughtfully, with taking time to consume it, thinking about the platform itself. What is the platform saying to you, whether it's a newsprint or online or radio or television? What's being said to you beyond necessarily the facts or the information, or the stories. But also, I think the important thing that's really stood out for me in this show, in researching for the show, is the importance of the locality and having a local context for your news. Without that, you're really kind of just floating in the sort of national or a global story pot, which may or may not have some relevance to you. Often it does, especially with larger serious issues like climate change or gun violence or what have you. But if you don't know what's happening kind of on your street, or you don't have any sort of relationship to what's happening, how are you going to be a responsible citizen to vote, or how will you responsibly make decisions in your life, right? So the local context, I think, is even more important.
Well, and I think that again, I could be extrapolating, but I'm a professional at that, so it's okay. But there is, when you come through it, there is a small note of advocacy for the news itself, which is really, we went into this whole digital news revolution thinking that the war was going to be, or the battle was going to be fought between who's going to want to read ink on paper and who's going to want to read it online, and we were completely taken aback by the fact that no, it's there are so many other things to do online. The battle is between getting people to pay attention to the news or not pay attention to the
altogether.
news.
Yeah.
And it's so I had talked about how some of the Free Press people have reacted to this. How have non-newspaper, non-ink stain wretches, as we like to call ourselves, how have they responded to the exhibit?
Yeah, so far, I mean, all the feedback I'm getting has been really good. I think, like yourself, most people who come to this show are expecting more of a historical show. But they seem to be pleasantly surprised that it's really an art show, and they seem to be really enjoying what the artists have to say here.
Yeah.
And are interested in kind of exploring and kind of amazed at some of the pieces like Miriam Dion's really elaborate, ornamental, totally painstaking mosaics really made out of newspaper are pretty incredible, and people really seem to identify with her work and just the beauty of it.
Yeah.
And then I've been checking out, we have little iPad stations around, and we have some poll questions in there, like for visitors just to leave their mark, and the comments have been really interesting and really fun, and so far so good.
I hope I hope their comments have a different tone than I normally get on email and, and social media.
So far, not so many like trolling kind of comments, surprisingly. Yeah.
It's funny, the trolls get everywhere though.
I'm sure they will.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about, like before we started recording, that this is also a very good example though of a bit of an evolution in what art galleries are doing. I've been very fortunate to go all over the world, and I've seen some of the world's great galleries. And my wife and I, when we visit, we've started to notice less sort of periodical examinations. I mean, that's great, right? And if you're a fan of a certain artist, to be able to go,
or a style,
immersive,
or a time,
but this connection to current events, maybe not in a newspaper sense, but connection to current events, interpretation of current events. We were in New Orleans and went to the New Orleans, I believe it's the New Orleans Museum of Art. And it was like we never wanted to leave. They had a photo exhibit on the blending of Haitian and French and culture, and about how Haitians and those from African countries had adopted the Louisiana French, the third line, so their funerals had become like part traditional Louisiana French influence, with the music, the jazz and everything, and part like they had circuses and flamethrowers, and it's unbelievable. And that's partly what this is, right? Like, this is connecting to the here and now, and not necessarily the past, which is fine, but it is an evolution.
That makes me so happy to hear you describe a show that you learned about more than just, an artist and what the artist wanted, or a time period, like you said, but about a whole culture and certain connections, right, between maybe American culture, Haitian culture. That is, I know that's the direction that art galleries are moving. It's definitely the way that Wegkamiyuk is operating now. Every day we think about the things that are important to the community, and what we can do to help facilitate what members and of the community, different communities in Manitoba, need and want and would like to see here, right?
Yeah.
We think about that all the time. So many discussions, and how to make it meaningful. Artists have always been interested in current events and what's happening, and have always expressed that, but galleries have been a lot more interested in the hierarchy of who's the best artist at doing that, or those kind of things. And now I think we're a lot more interested in becoming part of the cultural conversation and helping facilitate really other conversations and dialogues, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, listen, I lined up for Barnes, and bought tickets. I lined up for the Vatican collections, and I feel like, as a fan of art, like I feel that I gained a lot through those experiences. But, there's something like to go and be able to see something that's connected to the here and now, connected to the community outside. It's, I think it just broadens.
Yeah, exactly.
The experience. But it's, and there's a direct parallel to what newspapers are trying to do too.
Right.
We're doing podcasts now.
Yeah.
And
newspapers write history, right? Like they are they are writing our history for us. But so do galleries.
Yeah.
So, galleries write the history of art. Galleries write the history of our cultural history. And we've done a terrible job of it for, several centuries, because our job up until now has been very colonial. We've been writing a very specific colonial history and left out a lot of the communities that we now are hoping to revise that history, right? And become something different that is not colonial, or that we can never escape that colonial past, but at least shows people how to read that history, right? And how to read our everyday kind of interactions with that history, the way that newspapers, I think, are trying to.
I mean, to a certain extent, like we're still, anybody in a creative endeavor, you're never really at the end, right? You're always sort of,
it's not, there's no process. We're never going to be decolonized or completely indigenized. It's an ongoing process, or completely equitable, right? It's an ongoing process, but that's the point.
And
in a lot of ways, newspapers, like art, are both a reflection of our values as a society, and for a long time those have been settler values, and it's a reflection of the power and who has the power in our communities. But it's also newspapers, art galleries have an opportunity to step outside that as well, I think, too, and also reflect it back on us in a way that is critical, right?
Well, and I mean, I think looking at the way others see us. I mean, we're talking among ourselves, free pressers, about the headline wall.
Yes.
Okay.
Ron Toretta.
Yes. Which is incredibly. I'm not going to read them out. Well, I might read one out, but it's incredibly entertaining. Now, it's not like, I think, it was interesting as an interpretation because, really, this is a collection of some of the most cynically humorous things that have ever appeared in a newspaper. But, which is definitely, like, people who write headlines, they consider that to be its own art form.
Yeah.
But it's not. What's interesting is you probably had the choice of, like, D-Day headline, or because that's usually the way people in newspapers think about it. They think of
major historical
events, and the one that the one that really got me, which is the one that we were just killing ourselves. There's several, but Netflix doesn't want to be a better streaming service. It wants to be Disney.
Frowning poo among 67 possible new emoji.
I know. Looking at cat pictures is good for you, even if you're doing it to procrastinate. There's at least two people in my house are going to be thrilled that headline was dredged back up. But it is like, I'm sure other journalists do this, but, I write a column. When somebody nails the headline, I usually send them a note and say, because I don't write the headlines for my columns. And it is kind of its own art form. And now it has its own wall in the art gallery. So that is awesome.
Yeah, and actually Ron Toretta, so this is a piece by Ron Toretta. It's several canvases, white canvases with black text headlines painted onto them, and they're painted in the font of the New York Times. But they're all actual headlines that Ron culled from The Verge, which is a primarily online platform, news platform, and it's primarily geared towards a millennial audience, right? Whereas the New York Times is primarily geared towards, dare I say, like an older audience.
A more traditional audience.
More traditional. Okay, there you go. More traditional
yeah.
audience. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
And he's both poking fun at our kind of lack of attention span to the news, because the title of the piece is TLDR, which is too long, didn't read, but also pointing to that idea of the aesthetic of the news, and how something like the New York Times font has in itself become an indicator of authority or authenticity. And its aesthetic is one that we tend to take for granted and trust, right? Or as the case may be now, not trust. Very seen as the enemy, right, of real news or what have you. So, and it's talking about that physicality again too, or the design element that's so important in how we consume the news, and who is consuming what news.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, for that and Miriam Rudolph's work and the wallpaper. By the way, when we mentioned the wallpaper, like, it really is wallpaper.
Yeah.
Made out of Free Press images, like pages.
Yeah.
And will Paul be able to acquire wallpaper?
Yes, we have a digital file of it, so it can be printed on really anything.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it was designed by our designer Mike Carroll. He did an awesome job.
Yeah, no, it really is fantastic, and saw a lot of names of reporters that are no longer with the newspaper, and which was really kind of melancholy experience as well. But but my big thanks to you was that, like, people in newspapers, we all think newspapers are beautiful. Like, we actually think that what we do, there's some beauty in what we do, and obviously people disagree, but this is like, really, we kind of felt that this confirmed that a little bit, that other people could kind of see some of the beauty and the intrigue and whatever too. So thanks for that.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is an art form, and that's, even the online platforms for the news have a design aesthetic, right? And what amazes me about the newspaper or any kind of news platform is that those design elements, the aesthetic, the beauty of that is produced every single day.
Yeah.
Like, that's a crazy amount of work. and the fact that it comes out every day, and that it has this beautiful physical presence that is something we can identify immediately, whether we're consuming it or not, but even just walking by it in the 7-Eleven, is fascinating, and also really a lot more significant than I think we get credit for, right? Well,
we do still consider it the daily miracle, when the newspaper comes out, and particularly in an environment where fewer people are consuming news through traditional ways. But we live in hope and certainly things like this, I'm hoping it will drive some enthusiasm for the Free Press, but also just in general.
Yeah.
What I tell people is, like, read the Free Press. That would be really awesome for those of us who draw a salary from there. But if but read other stuff as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
which you should anyways. You should have, you should read your local context, absolutely. But you should read, a variety of sources and get a feel for what's out there, for a variety of voices, right?
Riva Symko, Winnipeg Art Gallery, thank you so much for the work you've done here. Like, we're all flattered, and
I'm really relieved to hear that.
Oh, no, for sure. Like, it's in a world where we sometimes think people actually hope that we fail. It's like, to see something like this is very, very empowering.
Thank you for that comment. I'm glad that you felt that.
Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
A huge miigwech and thanks to Riva Symko, curator of such a great exhibit that I got to see constructed as it went at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, honoring the 150 years of the Winnipeg Free Press. We're a little biased, I think, but it does a great job to tell our history, all the good, the bad, and the great parts, but also the really complicated parts of the ways that the Free Press has both told the story of this community, but also in many ways also contributed to some of the lighter, the most difficult moments of our community. It's an exhibit everyone should go and see. It's open till May 21st. I hope everybody gets a chance to go down to the art gallery to go see it.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. And no, we're not objective. And I will tell you that at least one of my colleagues, okay, so it was Paul Simin, the editor of the Free Press, when I remarked that I've been around for almost 37 of those years as a Free Press employee, the suggestion was made that they could include me in the exhibit as an artifact, maybe in a glass case, or I don't know, like I kind of imagine
could be a living one. People could, sort of pull you off the shelf and sit you down for a bit. You could narrate your stories of chasing around Gary Filmon.
Yeah, and then in the bottom, like as they do in art galleries, there'd be like a little information card, and it would say, ink stained wretch circa 1986. So
and you could rotate your clothing, going back to what it was like in 1988.
Yeah, there's no way I'm putting on my wardrobe from 1988. Let's just say I learned through those years that dark socks go with dark shoes. The long simmering national political story right now is the battle between the premiers and the federal government in Ottawa over more funding for healthcare. Manitoba's Premier Heather Stephenson's playing a significant role in this debate. She is the chair of the Council of the Federation, which is the gathering of Canada's first ministers, and she's been very front and center in what she calls the campaign for a quote fair and sustainable funding for the future of healthcare in the country. And it's funny because the premiers are right, and they're also wrong. I love stories where politicians are right or wrong. They're right in that the federal government could be doing more to support, financially support healthcare. They're wrong, however, in the idea that the money should just come to them without strings, because quite frankly, they haven't really shown that they deserve to spend the money without strings.
This is all about a month ago. The Council of the Federation got together, made demands of the federal government to say we need to raise from $38 billion transfer payments to about $73 billion. That's a very significant increase that can't be taken very lightly by the federal government. And the federal government was actually open to the idea of increasing the $38 billion significantly to the tune of about 20 to 25%. But how badly the premiers look in a situation in which many, particularly from right-leaning provinces, we're thinking Alberta, we're thinking, even right here, Manitoba to Ontario, offering checks, payment, tax credits, whatever else that they're offering. Many of these provincial governments are in situations of being reelected post-pandemic, trying to get political favor. Giving out money that they've been given by the federal government is a bad look, and then turning to the federal government and wanting more money. And of course, what they want increases of billions of dollars with absolutely no expectations. The federal government has been saying the number one thing that we want is a staffing guarantee, that ERs, long-term care facilities, these will be staffed adequately, and you must guarantee that these staffing there should be a staffing partnership agreement that to make sure that particularly long-term care facilities, which every province over the past few years has been condemned for, of doing badly by giving private ownership over to the care of seniors. And we know that during the pandemic, it was uncovered the bad conditions, the horrendous conditions, life and death conditions in those long-term care facilities. The federal government's been driven on an issue of pharmacy around childcare, and I think was willing to die on this hill, even to starve the premiers out, to say you must come to some kind of agreement to have some kind of controls over this money, or at least deliverables.
Yeah, the deliverables are really important. I mean, every province in this country has to acknowledge that as much as there's a funding crunch, it never seems there's going to be enough money to go around based on the demands. but provinces have not, and there are exceptions, but the provinces have not been innovative. They have not tried to find the structural, the non-monetary innovations and modernizations that they can bring to the table to make the system function better. Really, really good example that was brought up recently in Manitoba is that a couple of provinces do operate sort of a central booking and consultation service for family doctors and doctors in rural and remote areas. So, like, you know, if a family doctor in Carmen has a patient that may need specialist treatment, that doctor on his or her own has to call around individually to find a specialist who can do a consult for that patient. And then if in consultation with the specialist, they decide that, yes, they need specialist treatment, then they have to call around to hospitals to find an open bed and find a place and kind of schedule that treatment. And this is like so incredibly, I was going to use a bad word there, but it's blanked up. Because in Saskatchewan and a couple of other provinces, physicians can call a central number. They can speak to a knowledgeable person who will connect them with a specialist quickly. And then if there's a decision made they need specialist treatment, that central terminal also allows for like a treatment plan to be devised as quickly as possible. This is not a lot of money. This is pocket change. When you consider the billions of dollars that are being spent on healthcare, and yet without it, our system doesn't function efficiently. And moreover, it's tougher to recruit doctors to a province that doesn't have modern tools.
Anyone who's been to an ER knows that you're looking at anywhere between 14 to almost 20-hour waits. If it's not emergent, hospitals are sending people home for general procedures that should have been done coming out of the pandemic, year-long waiting lists. And so the pressure here has gotten to the point where things have gotten so absurd that former BC Premier John Horgan has offered to mediate these meetings, which he just previously was calling the federal government stupid, and now he wants to mediate. So this is how absurd things have gotten. The two big pressures that have come this week, there was a collective letter written by every head of every doctors association in the country, including nurses as well, that urged the federal government to go back to the table with the Council of the Federation. And then, of course, there is the ongoing pressing need of the federal government to deal with these issues, in particular the ways in which parents are demanding changes and this increase in child sickness that has led to many emergent cases for children. So those two pressures, I think, will force this meeting to happen. Whether there'll be changes is the big question. I think both sides need a win here. Yeah. Whether that happens sooner, we'll find out.
Yeah, I think as long as the provinces make the table stakes are money with no strings, we can actually fairly be cynical about their motivations. I mean, quite frankly, it's a national universal healthcare system. There should be similar standards across the country. And quite frankly, money with no strings attached is not the most important issue. The most important issue is bringing our healthcare system into the 21st century, making it run efficiently, spending money on things like home care, on preemptive health strategies to help people be healthier rather than focusing on treating them when they're sick. And, I'm not sure that the premiers quite see that as the most pressing concern. So this is a story that, we've got dozens of other podcasts we can fill with discussion about debate over federal healthcare funding. That's right. Yeah, you've heard it here first. We're doing dozens more podcast episodes. So,
and then we're gonna deal with the whole issue of private healthcare.
Yes.
And the condemnation of this whole issue is that the more right-leaning governments are trying to make the system inefficient intentionally to be able to increase and the argument for the private intervention. But that's for another day. thanks to Dan for taking some of the heavy lifting as I've been away out of the province.
And freezing in the dark.
I've been wearing shorts as I've been moving around here. But, big thanks as well to all our partners at CJNU and Adam Glynn, our producer. Huge thanks as well to our colleagues at the Free Press always, and particularly this week for unveiling themselves, showing off the history of the newspaper. And so Riva Symko at the Winnipeg Art Gallery and our storyteller, Brad Oswald.
Headlines is the name of the exhibit. And that's a heck of a headline you just came up with there. Free Press staff reveal themselves to Winnipeg. I think that's a winner.
I think we earned our paychecks this week.
That's right. Thanks to everybody who took the time to listen to our podcast, and we will see you in a week.
Miigwech, thanks.